This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The gods of war. Who are they, and how did they influence the Bible? Did they influence the Bible? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is our monthly Iron and Myth Roundtable session, and we are honored to, let me put it this way. I'm honored to call these men my friends. Always enjoy these conversations because they are fascinating and I learned something, and I pray that you do as well. Rejoining us this month after being away last month is the best-selling author and award-winning screenwriter, author of the theological thriller Cruel Logic, many other books, fiction and nonfiction, Brian Godawa, the pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado in Boulder, and the author of Giants, Sons of the Gods, now available in its 10th anniversary revised and expanded edition, as well as a number of other titles, Doug Van Dorn, and the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, author of Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim, his website, burtonbeyond.net. There'll be links to all the websites in the show notes. Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, interesting suggestion for the title or for the topic this month. And I'm surprised, here we are at episode number 27. We haven't talked about this before. Warrior gods, because when you do just a quick survey using the Book of Knowledge, Wikipedia, to search for war gods around the world, you find that some of the pantheons in some parts of the world are just chock full of gods of war. But even the Bible itself has references to not just warrior gods of the pagans, but God himself, Yahweh, is described as a warrior too. So, Judd, war gods, how important were they to the world of the patriarchs, say, the culture that produced Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how did that influence our understanding of God?
Crucial in a lot of ways. The age of the patriarchs is an age when city-state dwelling and empire building was how you did things. And so conquest was a part of everyday life for these big competing empires. And we talked on this program, I know I've talked about it on other programs, about how that model of the despotic tyrant king was a corrupted version of God's model for an ordered society. And the Watchers and their progeny turned that on its head. And that's why we have despots and tyrants, autocrats that have littered human history, and that's been the rule rather than the exception for human politics. And so it shouldn't surprise us a great deal that we find, like in many other parts of the world where there was that level of city-state dwelling and empire building, shouldn't surprise us a great deal that the age of the patriarchs and all of the cultures that are pertinent to that narrative had war deities and gods explicitly for war, and to one extent or another, even gods that were not specifically pronounced or identified as war gods, nonetheless, took up arms against other supernatural entities and gods. So, to one degree or another, you could classify most deities as a kind of war god, but there, of course, were deities that we'll get into tonight that were expressly tokens of the battlefield. They were identified with warcraft and combat and armies and empire building.
Brian, that's something that you kind of went into with your series, Chronicles of the Nephilim, and all of these cultures around ancient Israel trying to destroy Israel, because you got into the motives, motivation, actions of these entities who were trying to crush the Israelites, and of course the half-breed Nephilim. You then had to do a lot of research into the warrior gods of ancient Mesopotamia, the ancient Levant. What was your takeaway from that study?
Yeah, a few things. One is that, like, people need to understand that while we're familiar with, I think it seems like the Greek gods are probably the most familiar to most people, So we hear or Roman gods, right? The god of war is Ares, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, like, one of the coolest examples of that was Wonder Woman, the movie. I liked how they dealt with that, but or the Roman god, which was Mars of war. But we have to understand that while there are gods of war specifically, it's not like just singular. There are, and in many of the religions, there are gods of war, and in fact, many of the gods, like, for instance, say you have, like in the Bible, you might have Ishtar showing up, but more as Ashtart or, Ashtoreth, because all these, mutations of the gods and goddesses, right? That was a god of sex, love, and war. Anat, who was the Canaanite sister of Baal, she was a war goddess deity, but also of sex and also of, other elements. So it's sort of a mishmash of things, you know what I mean? And Egypt also was one that I looked into, which, they all have pantheons full of gods, but it seems like it almost, to me, it's like Egypt seems to have the most. Now, I haven't done study yet on the Hindu gods, so I'm sure there's more Hindu gods, but Egypt just has so many gods. It's so hard to keep track of them. And there are multiple gods of war. Now, there's one god, Montu, who was, an Egyptian war god. And there was a god for the Egyptian army whose name was Anhur, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that's, there's a plurality, and it's not just singular. And I think what Judd was saying too is something that I think is important to understand, which is that you don't have to be a war god to war with Yahweh or his people. And then by the time, or shall we say, then when Yahweh is described in responding to these gods, there are many, verses that say God, Yahweh is a man of war, or Yahweh is the divine warrior, that kind of thing. There's a lot of that in there. So, but I think the ones that sort of stand out the most would be that in the Bible that are the specific gods of war in battle. Oh, that was the other thing. The motif that we've always talked about is the watcher paradigm. That is this notion that over the nations and over cities and earthly authorities, there were heavenly principalities and powers and authorities. And that's why there's a lot of language. When there's a war on earth, there's a war in heaven. And we have to keep in mind that motif, because that will come into play when we look at Yahweh in particular. But the two that stand out to me, that were very relevant to all my novels, which were Pharaoh as a god, but he was also described as a mighty war god, and Baal. Baal would be the Canaanite deity, who has a whole mythology behind him as well. But those are two important ones that I think rise up. And just to focus on Pharaoh to start with, and I think he's very very relevant for our interest, because Yahweh in Exodus 12:12, for instance, he says, "On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh." And in Numbers 33, on the gods, Yahweh executed judgments. So God is warring against these Egyptian gods, and not just the war gods, but all the gods. But then particularly in the Exodus, in the Song of the Sea, and we know that that's the incident that sort of typifies God's overthrow of Pharaoh, right? And his armies in the Red Sea. And in Exodus 15, when we're reading about the Song of the Sea, it says, "The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea," etc. So there's God warring against Pharaoh. But the interesting thing about it is, and this is going to be a motif with Baal later as well, is that the biblical writers draw on the language of these war gods, and they sort of transpose it onto Yahweh as now liberal scholars will say that that's because Israel evolved or borrowed from these other religions. But we've often spoke of how it's actually done as a polemical technique. So, for instance, Pharaoh, there's many, ancient references to pharaohs throughout history in Egyptian documents describing Pharaoh as having a strong right arm. This was an expression of almighty power and deity. That strong right arm is the arm that carries the tool that bashes the head of the enemy, that kind of a thing. And this was referred to by many pharaohs, so it was a commonly known thing. So in the in the biblical text, when God says, for instance, Exodus 6, Lord says to Moses, "Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land." That's that reference to Pharaoh and his belief. But then it says, and later it says, "I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from the burden of the Egypts. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment." And later, or in Exodus 3, "I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt by a mighty hand." So, this notion that, in other words, the writers are using the notion of this war, this deity of war as on earth, Pharaoh, and using it to describe God himself as that battling war against that God, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one example. We can talk about Baal too, but just wanted to sort of open up with that. That was I guess the Bible, when it refers to these war gods, it's in context with Israel's battle against those nations, as well as Yahweh.
Doug, the one of the questions that came in through our mobile app, which has got a really neat little messaging section. It's almost become sort of a self-contained social media platform, but it's off the internet, so you can actually say stuff without worrying about being canceled. Said that they've encountered some people in an online forum who are pointing to Yahweh in the Old Testament and some of these warlike polemics that Brian mentioned, and saying, well, see, that's not Jesus. Because Jesus is, and I guess they're thinking, baby Jesus, meek and mild and all that, and ignoring the prophetic stuff when he comes back as a warrior leading an army. They see the Jesus that they want to see, but they want to separate him from Yahweh. I mean, how do we as Christians process that? Because, Jesus is love and forgiveness and so on. And yet we've got these images in the Old Testament of Yahweh as a warrior, and we'll dig into some more of those as this conversation goes on. How do we reconcile that apparent conflict?
And that is a great question, whoever asked that one. So, I mean, there's a lot of directions I could go with this. Here's a couple that come to the top of my mind. The first one is what Brian referenced a minute ago, Exodus 15, the Song of Moses, celebrating the victory of his people and the destruction of Pharaoh in the Red Sea. And in that verse, I think it's verse 3 or 4, that the Lord is a man of war. You have to understand that this is one of the second power in heaven texts that is describing the God of Israel. In this case would be, in my opinion, the angel of the Lord. You're not to think of this in terms of God and his essence, and you're not to think of this in terms of the Father God. This is the battle of sons against sons. It's kind of the way that it always is in all the myths. The Baal cycle, it's Baal fighting Yam, and those are the two sons of El. And so this I think is really the main motif of the entire Old Testament whenever we find a divine warrior text, and there's lots of them. Another one that comes to mind is Psalm 29. Huge divine warrior passage, and it's directed as kind of a polemic or an attack against Baal himself. It's funny, I went to the Wikipedia like you did, Derek, for the war gods, and it did not say that Baal is a war god, and I was really surprised by that. And it also did not say that Marduk is a war god. And I was like, wow, because when you read the Baal cycle, the whole thing is about war. It's about Baal getting his victory over his beloved brother. Yam is the beloved son of El, and it ticks Baal off so bad that he has to go and kill him. Mm-hmm. And then he ends up getting a house for himself. because he becomes the victor. If that's not a warrior God, I don't know what is. Marduk, very similar in Babylon. The stories are highly similar, and like there's a whole motif of the way that these things work, where you have a conflict, you have a victory, you have kingship, you have house building, you have a celebration, and you have a blessing. And this comes from a fellow named Timothy Gombis, who, and this hopefully will be the one that will most directly answer your question. Although I think these others also very directly do too, but he did his dissertation on Ephesians. And so when I preached Ephesians several years ago, I had 5 sermons in a row. Now this is Ephesians, New Testament. It's all about Jesus. And I had 5 sermons: the Divine Warrior 1, the King; the Divine Warrior Part 2, the Threat of the Zombie and the Triumph of the King; Divine Warrior Part 3, the Threat of the Law and the Triumph of Messiah; Divine Warrior Part 4, building his house; Divine Warrior Part 5, the Divine Warrior and Paul's imprisonment. And what Gamba shows is that the book of Ephesians, in those first 2 or 3 chapters, is following the exact same style and motif of these ancient war documents of these gods, where there's this conflict, there's this victory, he builds his house, and there's this celebration. Ephesians is doing this for who? For Jesus Christ.
Jesus. Wow.
So, there's lots of different directions you can take the New Testament, some New Testament examples. You can take Jesus's victory in constant war and battle against Satan in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, especially in books like Luke. You can go to this idea of 2 powers in heaven. You can understand that these texts are talking about Israel's God, there being the Son of God, especially, so that we're not somehow divorcing the New Testament from the Old. We're not divorcing and creating 2 different gods that we worship or something like that. This is so not the biblical narrative. I can't even tell you, but it is very much something that we've inherited for whatever reason, even in conservative, evangelical, and even some reform circles. I don't know why, but it is. So this question hits the mark, man, and I'm glad that they asked it, because I think there's some really, really good answers to it.
Well, and I agree. I mean, we can't avoid the fact that the Hebrew phrase, Yahweh Sabaoth, Lord of hosts, is used about 260 times in the Old Testament. I mean, that literally means Lord of armies.
Right.
So, I mean, if you're following a deity who you call Lord of armies, you got to accept that he's got a martial nature of some sort. Then how do you reconcile that with, but we're still the good guys?
Yeah.
I think it is interesting that we see the, Brian, as you pointed out, some of the direct conflict with some of these other entities in Scripture. I mean, the parting of the Red Sea at a place called Baal Zephon. That's what started me down this whole rabbit trail about 7 years ago. Sharon and I stumbled on that in our weekly Bible study. It's like, wait a minute, was that always in there? Why is Baal in Egypt? I knew nothing about the Amorites or the Hyksos at that time, the rulers of northern Egypt during the time of the sojourn, at least the beginning of the Israelite sojourn in Egypt. But the fact is that Baal continued to be worshipped by the Egyptian pharaohs down to the time of Ramses the Great in the middle of the 13th century BC. So a lot of those Canaanite deities, like Resheph, the plague god, who was also depicted as a warrior, was worshipped by the pharaohs. In fact, Dr. Doug Petrovich makes a really good case that Resheph, or that Amenhotep II, was the pharaoh of the Exodus and his personal protector god, because Resheph was believed to be a protector of chariot warriors, was the personal protector deity of Amenhotep. The pharaoh of the Exodus, protected by the plague god and protector of chariot warriors. Like, oh, okay. Well, how did Yahweh free his people? By destroying his chariots after a series of plagues. So
yeah, I think this is in the question that Doug was answering as well, but I think it addresses one of the primal questions that everyone has a hard time with. How can a loving God be engaged in all this violence and stuff?
Right.
I mean, this kind of takes it more down an apologetics angle. I don't want to dwell too much there because, for me, it's a matter of, well, I don't have to justify God or reinterpret him to fit my soft Western paradigm of, violence is bad or something. I have to see, well, what is God like and understand and accept him on his terms and change my theology to match that. So when I see things like what Doug was referring to, the angel of Yahweh all throughout the Old Testament, I mean, he slaughters, what is it, tens of thousands of Assyrians. And this is the angel of Yahweh. And a study of that is very clearly, it's Jesus. And now, there's a difference theologically because we would argue that the human incarnation of Jesus as Messiah had a very specific purpose of peacefully and innocently being killed, obviously for the atonement of sins, etc. So his personal mission on earth in the physical human incarnation was peaceful, but that is a very specific calling and theological threadline that God was achieving his purposes. But that same Jesus, when he is not incarnate as a human, because this is before he's been born, right? The angel of Yahweh, before that, as a different form of God on earth, however you want to figure that out is fine, but I don't understand it. But so he clearly can be that violent warrior that people don't like. And yeah, people can make that, think that's an argument against our God or something, as if the creator of the universe is not allowed to go ahead and destroy everything he makes, like as if that makes him bad. See, I don't have the problem that a lot of people have because I have the understanding that whatever God creates, he can do whatever he wants with it. He can destroy it. He can use a vessel for good or a vessel for evil. He can do whatever he wants. But I realize that is the, yeah, exactly. His game is rules. And I think all of us in this context, I think it's important for us to get on to more interesting things because we all understand God that way. We don't need to try to defend God, but I do think it helps Christians to face that fact because Christians have been infected by that notion that God is not a warrior. And the fact is he is. Yeah. And, one of the things that we've started talking about is Baal, and there's this Baal is the Canaanite god, and that's the land that the Israelites were going into. And so he's probably the number one foe throughout, most of the text there. And Baal was a storm god, and the war gods were often storm gods. And there's several elements to the Baal identity that the Old Testament writers assume onto Yahweh. And again, from our perspective, they're basically saying Baal's not the storm god or whatever. Yahweh is. So they're using the same language, but there's several motifs. One is Baal is a cloud rider, and in the Baal epic, there's many references to he rides the clouds. What does this mean? On his chariots, and that's basically a notion of judgment. And the other thing is he's a storm god and he rides the clouds. And he basically uses armies of people as his means of judgment. And we see these same three elements, I would argue, in Yahweh, when Yahweh is described over and over as the cloud rider. And what does that mean? Well, if you look at those passages, you'll see that they're always Yahweh comes on the clouds and he's coming in judgment, whether it's against Israel or against Egypt or Syria. That terminology is used. So he rides the clouds. And, just one classic example, I think, is Jeremiah 4. Jeremiah is a prophet of the exile, and he's talking about how Babylon's going to come against Israel. And he says, Jeremiah 4, behold, he comes like the clouds, his chariots like the whirlwind. And in Isaiah, it talks about God rides a swift cloud. But it says in verse 16, warn the nations, he is coming. And that in context, that's Yahweh. Yahweh is coming, announced to Jerusalem, besiegers come from a distant land. And, we don't have time to exegete the whole passage. So the idea here is talking about the besiegers are the Babylonian armies. but it's saying Yahweh is coming on the clouds. Yahweh is coming than the Babylonian besiegers. So there's an equivalency there that's saying, and again, this is one passage is out of many. We've got it in Ezekiel. We've got it all over the place. But it's this notion that God is a God of war. He comes on the clouds in judgment against a people and city or whatever. And in this case, it's against Israel. But he also does it against Nineveh. He also does it against Babylon. He comes on the clouds in judgment, and he does it through foreign armies. Literally, like Isaiah 10 talks about, the king of Assyria is the axe in my hand, and the hand is the literal action. This isn't a, Weasley Christian little, oh, God allows it. No, it's God's doing it. That's the text. And he's doing it through the armies, foreign armies. And so he's judging, for instance, Israel in 586 when he went into exile, right? He's judging Israel by destroying that temple, by taking them out through the armies. The Babylonian armies are God coming in judgment. God's using them for his purposes, in other words, Mm-hmm. So that's a motif that just stretches throughout the whole Old Testament, particularly exilic literature, because that's where you've got Babylon and Assyria and all these nations coming against each other. But that to me is one of the most, fascinating elements of this divine warrior motif, which I would argue, no matter what interpretation you have of Jesus coming on the clouds, you can see that there's a precedent in the Old Testament to help flesh that out and give it more meaning.
I have a question I would like to ask all three of you guys, because I don't know the answer to it, because the war gods themselves are not my expertise at all. But just hearing Brian talk, thinking about Jesus and God in the Old Testament, same thing, and yet God is bigger than Jesus because it's also Father and Spirit. When God comes as the divine warrior in Scripture, he's coming as the warrior who is judging sin and rebellion. He's coming in righteousness, to bring righteousness, to bring back truth, to punish evil. Like that is what it's only about. He's never vindictive just because he wants to be sadistic or something like that. That's not it. I mean, there's that famous quote that one of the four horsemen, atheist horsemen of the apocalypse gives, Richard Dawkins, where he has this long, strewn out list of adjectives of God being the sadistic, masochistic, blah, 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 blah. And that's why he can't believe in it. Well, that's not the biblical picture of why the divine warrior comes ever. Like ever. One other thing before I get to the question, which is Jesus, when he is a warrior in the New Testament, but he's not judging and coming against humanity. He's judging and coming against the evil powers, because he's going to bring a kingdom that's a spiritual kingdom to this earth. Later he will come and judge humanity when the last day comes. Up until then, it's kind of like we get a reprieve to some degree. It doesn't mean he's not still judging nations and causing them to rise and fall, but specifically when it comes to the law and the gospel, their purpose is to bring salvation. And so I like what Brian said about that Jesus had a very specific reason for coming in the flesh, and it doesn't contradict who he is in his essence as the divine warrior. And he is fighting, but he isn't coming to fight the way a lot of people think. So it gets to my question, which is this. Do the gods of the nations, when they are depicted as these warrior gods, are they coming to judge sin and to bring in righteousness, or is it more capricious than that? Is it selfish? Is it egotistic? Is it narcissistic? Is it all these kinds of things? How would you describe or compare the divine warrior Yahweh to these other warrior gods?
I think you've hit on something. In fact, you took the words right out of my mouth. Caprice. If you compare the motives of Yahweh as a warrior God, as the ultimate warrior God, representing that divine kingship, that divine order, and it draws a sharp line in juxtaposition against the gods of the nations and these specific specifically, but not exclusively, these so-called gods of war. But it goes back to the comments that I made at the beginning of our discussion, that what the demonic does is it takes this proper, good, righteous, perfect, and just order, in terms of, as Sharon would say, theopolitics, takes that and turns it on its head. And that's why we have all these despotic rulers and kingdoms that litter history. And the same with the gods that were over, in this case, war gods that we're talking about tonight, the same with those gods that were over these kingdoms. And so it is very selfish and capricious, and their motives are very base and agenda driven. So I would say that there's a sharp contrast between the gods of the nations for whatever their motives and interests are, and that's something that we've talked about on this program before as well. They don't align with Yahweh because they're in one way, shape, or form they've been in rebellion against Yahweh, and so their motives are completely removed from God as the divine warrior.
That's something the skeptics like to ignore, the fact that these entities of the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, all of the other pantheons are often depicted as acting like humans except with superpowers. The same kind of frailties and follies and lusts and jealousies and angers and so on. It's just that they've got, the power to literally split the earth or send lightning bolts from heaven to back up whatever their human emotions are. I mean, the story of Gilgamesh rejecting Inanna, the goddess of sex and war, sex and violence, really. She gets so upset, she goes to the sky god Anu and demands that he release the bull of heaven to destroy his entire city because he turned her down. So that is not Yahweh. Besides the fact that Yahweh pre-existed all things, and all of the deities worshipped by the pagans had a mother and a father. So fundamental differences that the skeptics like to overlook.
Yeah, and yet, I mean, I have no shame in saying, I think the primary distinction is God says he's a jealous God, meaning, what does that mean? Is that a sin? No, jealousy means that there's a priority of, or an ultimacy of commitment over everything else. And so if you don't worship Yahweh as he deserves, he will judge you, and so there's that component to it that I think, which is why if you look throughout the Old Testament, he's mostly dealing with Israel. He does judge other Gentile nations, but his dealings is with Israel, and it's all about the relationship, the idolatrous relationship that Israel has that causes him to react in that way. And we understand that this kind of jealousy is not inherently sinful.
Right.
Because just look at marriage. Well, when you commit in marriage, you're committing to that one person. So if you're violating your oath to that person, that's a justifiable jealousy, which is why we have laws related to that, right? And so that's how God is with his creation, and if we worship him or not. But the other thing is that Jesus, and I did this in my novel, Jesus Triumphant, because I just thought it would be so wild and Christians would have a hard time with it, is it's already been brought up about the spiritual warfare that's going on, Christ and the powers. And we've, of course, talked about this extensively as well. But there's this notion of spiritual warfare that is very much in the text. And again, we may have, I'm not sure what differing, interpretations we all have on this show related to this. But one of my favorite passages is Colossians 2:15, and that is where it says Christ, it's talking about Christ dying on the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities, that's these principalities and powers, and he put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. And the notion that I see there is that Christ's death and resurrection, and ultimately ascension into heaven as king, but his death and resurrection was actually disarming them. And this language of triumph, which is also used elsewhere in the New Testament, of the spirit related to spiritual powers, the Roman triumph in particular, but there are other, throughout history, they've had triumphs, but Rome had it, particularized. And the triumph was where the king that defeats a city would take the leaders, mostly of the loser, And dead or alive, they would, and particularly in Rome, they would bring them to Rome and drag them through the streets, wheel them on carts, dead or alive, bring them up to the Capitol Jupiter, I don't know, Capitoline Jupiter or something, and they would sacrifice them there, you know. And that was the expression to the people of Rome, you know, Caesar is still king, and to the defeated peoples, it was their rubbing their noses in their defeat and their loss, right? And so when it talks about Jesus disarming and, you know, triumphing over in them, that's the picture you get also in Ephesians, you know, where it's, you know, he brings his captives in triumph. It's like he's dragging those gods of the nations through the streets in triumph. That's military. And so I actually tried to deal with that issue, you know, in the Jesus triumphant, where, and some Christians like reacted like, Jesus was peaceful, but this is after he resurrected, right? You know, and I'm like, well, yeah, but this is what the Bible says spiritually in the spiritual realm. He did that to the spiritual powers, and what that might look like, I don't know, but I tried to depict it, you know, and but it's a wild image if you think about it, but it's clearly there theologically, Christ having that victory over the powers in it's a military concept, the triumph, you know.
And
Brian,
I'm glad you brought up
this
Ephesians
is crazy.
4.
I just came across this week at preaching through the crucifixion scene in Luke and Mark, especially Mark. So these all overlap, but there's been really good arguments made that the whole scene, starting with Simon of Cyrene carrying the crossbar, all the way going to the cross, to the two guys that are nailed next to Jesus being offered wine that he refuses to take, to the mocking, that what they're arguing is that the Gospels are writing this very story as a kind of anti-subversive Roman triumph thing. So that Jesus actually does end up triumphing, but doing it exactly the opposite way is what always happens in Rome. It's really, I was like,
that's cool.
That's so crazy.
That is
cool.
wild.
But I'm glad you brought up that reference to Ephesians 4, Brian, because I wanted to jump to Psalm 68, because that's a very clear depiction. Psalm 68 is what Paul quoted in Ephesians 4, beginning at verse 15, "O mountain of God, mountain of Bashan." And as Mike Heiser pointed out, that phrase in Psalm 68:15, "O mountain of God, Har Elohim," probably means, because it's referring to Mount Hermon, probably should be translated mountain of God's, mountain of Bashan, because the mountain of God is Zion, not Hermon. Mountain of God's, mountain of Bashan, O many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God desired for his abode? Yes, where Yahweh will dwell forever. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. Another translation, the New English translation, renders it, he marches forth from Sinai in splendor. It's a difficult passage. You ascended on high, leading a host of captives in your train. And that's what Paul quoted. But when you go down to Psalm 68, verse 22, this is really interesting. And this may go back to a pre-Adamic conflict between Yahweh and Leviathan. The Lord said, "I will bring them back from Bashan. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea." But a scholar, Dr. Nicholas Wyatt, says that is more likely properly translated, "From Bashan I shall bring back from the depths," Yam, which is the Hebrew word for sea, but it's also the Canaanite name of their chaos dragon, Leviathan. So, "From Bashan I shall bring back chaos," Leviathan. So here we've got this psalm that is depicting Mount Hermon as a sort of enemy camp. A Canaanite Olympus is how one scholar, Edward Lipinski, described it. Angry at the mountain that God chose for his abode, Zion, and then God apparently leading heavenly chariots against this Canaanite Olympus and leading captives away.
Sort of following up on that, a couple of episodes ago, I referenced Jesus' fulfillment of the Genesis 3:15 prophecy by by literally walking around that area, in Bashan and parts of Upper Galilee at the foot of Mount Hermon. He's fulfilling that because he Doug and I have been on this crazy journey working on this Serpent Mound book. Jesus is literally crushing the head of the serpent with every step that he takes in this land. If that's not military action, if it's not mocking Baal and Marduk and Zeus and every one of these kingly warrior gods that is supposedly defeated the chaos dragon or the serpent, I don't know. That, to me, that seems awfully militaristic.
Well, then you get Psalm 74, verse 12. Yet God, my King, is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea. You divided Yam. You divided the Canaanite chaos monster by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness, which would seem to be a reference to the Enuma Elish, where Marduk defeated Tiamat, their chaos dragon, split the body, and created all of the known creation from the body of the chaos dragon.
We made the argument a while ago, I think, on this program, Derek, and I know I've talked to all of you guys about this, that when Jesus feeds the 5,000, that there's a really good chance that it's the very same place that you believe that the baptism was, just north of the Sea of Galilee, by the second wheel of giants that we got to visit, and that they discovered there two hieroglyphs, and one was a fish and one was a serpent. And so the idea being there and you have to go back to the Targum of Psalm 23 to really see this. Of course, Psalm 23 is the famous, the Lord is my shepherd psalm. But there you have in the Targum that you're feeding and feasting upon Leviathan. And so the idea seems very plausible that Jesus, in feeding the 5,000 people there, is actually doing the very thing that you're talking about, with kind of a military banquet victory with these people who don't even have the foggiest idea what's going on.
Let me throw another one in here, because this one was only I only stumbled onto this by looking at the New English translation, which we love to look at because the translators very kindly published all of their notes as to why they chose what they did. Psalm 82 is that famous courtroom scene in heaven, of course. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. The Net Bible translate that phrase, translated in the ESV divine council. It's Adat El in the Hebrew. So the Net Bible translates it, God stands in the assembly of El. And translators chose to do that because they argue that this may refer to, this may be a polemic where the God of Israel, Yahweh, basically appears in the middle of the council of the enemy and condemns them for judging unjustly these humans who don't have any understanding, don't have any knowledge, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. And because they weren't doing that, Yahweh decrees a death sentence on all of these on these rival gods.
I haven't heard that one.
The divine council, divine council, is an interesting enough concept as it is. It's like a courtroom scene in heaven with Yahweh presiding over the court. And I'm okay with that interpretation. But if it is, in fact, he appears in the assembly of El, man, it's like God shows up in the midst of the rebels.
Against that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Huh.
And if so,
Very
did that happen in Psalm 68? Or did it happen when Jesus went to Caesarea Philippi?
Well, there's certainly different components at different points of Christ's ministry, all the way to his death and resurrection. That these all sort of reflect these different. I don't know if we can nail it down as a, historically this is when events occurred, but it's certainly all part of the theological package, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. And you brought up Psalm 68 and Ephesians 4, and Gombis in that dissertation. From what I remember, this was 5-6 years ago now, but he kind of stops his divine warrior idea. At least I did in my sermon, so I assume he does, and maybe chapter 2 or 3. But you're continuing right on into chapter 4. If the whole thing up to that point has been about the divine warrior, why in the world would those two verses not continue that theme? And especially when you go to, I mean, it goes to the end of the book, doesn't it? Because in chapter 6, what are we doing? Now we are picking up the weapons of our warfare, and we're trying to understand in light of his warfare what it is that we fight, not against flesh and blood.
I like it.
So the whole book of Ephesians is about this, and people, to open somebody's eyes to that for the first time is pretty exciting thing to do.
Yeah, because a lot of people just get stuck in that verse in Ephesians 5 where it's, wait, women should submit to their husbands? Forget it, I'm out,
Yeah.
Again, Brian, you alluded to this. It's the habit that we have in the modern church with our Western 21st century sensibilities of wanting a God who lives up to our standards.
Yeah. And I've fallen victim to that as well. And so I understand the temptation,
But the idea of a warrior leading his people forth is not uncommon among Bible scholars. I mean, the idea that the Lord, when he marched out from Sinai, in fact, the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, where she says, Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped. Yes, the clouds dropped water. Okay, he's really the weather god, the storm god, not Baal. But then you've got that interesting verse in Judges 5, verse 20. This is recounting the war the battle between Barak and the Canaanites. From heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. So was there more going on there? Were there some heavenly chariots involved in that conflict? The chariots that went out in front of the army of Israel against the Syrians. So, this is not an uncommon theme in Scripture.
I think it would be important, too, though, for us to also make another nuanced distinction and to remind people that, the holy wars of Yahweh, that is taking over Canaan, that is also a very historically rooted, anchored concept that I would argue is not relevant to today. In other words, even in the Old Testament, there was a difference between war, and there was just wars in terms of wars of defense, how to treat people. Don't God give even directions, don't scorch the whole land, this kind of thing. But that had to do with normal war activity because evil people are going to try to kill you. So you have to defend yourself. That's a normal, acceptable concept. But that's even different from the holy wars and the holy wars of Joshua and such. Those are the passages where a lot of people will go to as examples of their problems, and then also accuse Christians. So this is what you think you want to do today? You Christians are violent and stuff. And there is a distinction between Christianity in that Christianity is not, it is the fulfillment of the Old Testament Judaism in Messiah, Jesus, but there is, because of Messiah coming, there's a transformation, and that old covenant, package of the land and conquering the people for the land, etc. It's been done away with in Christ, because now all the nations, all the Gentile nations are now freed and can come into the kingdom of God in a way they couldn't in the Old Testament. And there was a more of a violent takeover in the Bronze Age world or what have you. But what I'm saying is there's no shame in saying that is no longer applicable. We do not claim the holy wars. And so that was very specifically related to certain things that have a whole theological background, right? The Nephilim and the giants, but we're not saying that. We don't claim that. And it's not contradictory or anything, because it's very much rooted in that. But when Christ comes, he has that ultimate victory in the spiritual realm that then frees the whole earth is now, Jesus is king over all the earth. And there's no longer this distinction between, or shall we say, it's not just God's people and everybody else who are evil, but now men and women from every tribe, every tongue, and every nation can come into the kingdom of God. And so therefore we are a peaceful faith in that we propagate through the proclamation of the gospel, not through the sword like Islam does. Mm-hmm. But again, I have no problem admitting that there was the sword in that specific time period, but you have to understand it in its context, which is something the left is always trying. Oh, when it's trying to defend itself, it's okay to appeal to context. So, but we can't do that ourselves. No, well, we can, and it makes a difference.
Yeah,
It
the
does.
same people that are warmongering
Right.
all
Yeah,
over
right
the world.
now.
Yeah, everywhere you go, we must have more and more and more and more and more wars. We must have
Yeah.
more wars. Must. The same people that stood standing up in the 60s saying, we've got to have some peace here. What's going on? Now these are the
Yeah.
same people that are, we
Yeah.
must have more.
It's
Total
the-
warmongering. I
It's
love
the
what you just said.
incarnation of the Hegelian dialectic.
My
It
goodness.
absolutely is. Absolutely is. But, Brian, you're right. Ultimately, this war is against the spirit realm. And I suggest that Isaiah 24 captures that. It's a prophecy of that day. Isaiah 24, beginning in verse 21. On that day, which is the day of Yahweh, the Lord will punish the host of heaven in heaven and the kings of the earth on the earth. They will be gathered together as prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison, and after many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be confounded and the sun ashamed. And I would suggest that, given the popularity of the sun and the moon as deities for the pagans in the ancient world, that was also a polemic against their pantheons. So I think that there is more to that prophetic utterance of Isaiah than would appear. I don't think he's just being picturesque in his language.
Well, I mean, in fact, throughout all the prophecies in the Old Testament, whether it's the, Babylon or Israel or Edom, all their historical judgments, they use that same collapsing universe imagery. Sky rolled up like a scroll, moon turning to blood. All that stuff was, again, symbolism of the supernatural principalities and powers and the earthly powers. The powers that be are falling, and that's a very beautiful, I think, poetic way of describing it. But I do think there is a supernatural connection to it, because the hosts of heaven, that's what they worshiped, right? So it makes sense that the hosts of heaven would fall, when nations are being conquered or something.
I think you can put a little bit of flesh to what you're saying. I think about Daniel 10, because that's where we get kind of the two mentions of these princes of the nations, the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. Well, what's the context in which that comes? Well, Daniel's praying, and he wants an answer to his prayer, and for whatever reason, God dispatches Gabriel, but he says, sorry, man, I know that you thought that God wasn't listening to you, but I was kind of delayed for 3 weeks because I was fighting against the prince of Persia. What? That's a war. It's turf wars. This is literally divine council stuff taking place right in front of us. The turf wars happening. And the fact that, Derek brought up Psalm 82 earlier, well, that the very last verse of Psalm 82 is exactly what Brian was just saying. Arise, O God, you will inherit all the nations. The promise given in Psalm 2 is now a sealed deal. And the whole point of Jesus coming is that this is how this is fulfilled. Not a second coming, his first coming. That's when this is fulfilled. That's when this opens up. Pentecost is the proof of it. People are being saved from every nation under heaven. And this is the reason why Christianity was mistaken to do these holy wars that they did during the Crusades or whatever, which I would argue there was a lot of self-defense going on in there to kind of
absolutely
help them a little bit. It's not like totally they were evil, but I do think that there was some confusion going on of what you're saying, that this is what the New Testament teaches us. And it's, if you don't understand the spiritual component of this, then you can take it in so many weird directions and in dangerous directions.
That's a very good point.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot more in there, and I love the book of Daniel because of his reference to the Watchers in chapter 4, and the parallel verse in the reference to the Watchers who come down and decree the punishment on Nebuchadnezzar for his pride. There's another phrase that's used in the Aramaic as Kedushin, the holy ones. So this decree is by the decree of the watchers, the judgment by the holy ones. So the holy ones, that phrase there, referring to the watchers. And then when you go to Daniel 7 and the little horn on that fourth beast that Daniel prophesied, which most scholars of end times prophecy will connect with the Antichrist figure. I think what's really interesting is that that verse, as I look, the horn made war with the saints. That's that same word, kedeshin, and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the kedeshin, the saints of the Most High. I think this is war in the heavenlies. We see the word saint in English and we assume that we know what it means, that it's referring to righteous people who are following God, but that's not how Daniel used it back in chapter 4. So this may indicate, again, more war taking place.
Well, and there's another
between God and his
There's
armies.
another nuance to those passages in Daniel too. The word used there for angel and watcher, both in Hebrew and in the Aramaic, Irim and Irim, also means cities, which brings us back to the sort of the territorial empire building, fallen, despotic city state that we started with tonight. And so you could take this so many different directions if you don't look at the context and the nuance of the language that's being used. But again, when we just let the words say what they say in context, then we begin to pick up on the nuance. But it's hard to get away from the warlike territorial nature of the gods of the nations when looking at a word like ear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, not every use of that word in the Old Testament, obviously. Sometimes a city is just a city, but there are a couple of places like Isaiah 14. In fact, we put this on the cover of our book Veneration because we think this is what this means. This is a condemnation of the divine rebel in Isaiah 14. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities or watchers. So, yeah, it is. I would argue for the other argument in the other interpretation and context, but I could do and have done an entire hour just by myself on Isaiah 14.
I got one more question for all you
with
guys.
the understanding and the admission, by the way, that I'm not aware of any other scholars who are with us in that interpretation. So we could just be out on the limb sawing it off behind us there, Sharon and me. So anyway.
I got another question for you guys. It's a question about male deities of war versus female deities of war, goddesses.
Oh.
And I know, Brian, what you do with, at least for the sake of the novel, with the female and male, which is really an interesting idea. But you have Mars, Ares is the war god, but then you also have Asherah, Isis, that whole thing. So what do you guys make of these female warrior deities in respect to the male warrior deities?
Gender confusion.
They believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, exactly.
Except it's
There's
diversity,
your diversity
inclusion,
and equity.
Yeah, die.
I thought I would get more than like a 2-second sarcastic answer, but okay.
No, actually, I think Sharon especially has argued that Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, Aphrodite, Venus, and probably others, she's probably also manifests as Artemis, is really, really important even to this day. She is the same entity who is known as Queen of Heaven in Scripture. She is also called Queen of Heaven today, although I know, not to step on the toes of Roman Catholics, Mary is not the Queen of Heaven. And this is not me saying,
wear it, Catholics.
Yeah, and this is not me making this up. There are secular scholars who say, yes, this worship was syncretized into the Roman Catholic Church, sadly. But what's really bizarre is that Ishtar, Inanna, the Hurrian version of her, Shauska, really illustrates this. There's a very famous series of inscriptions, carvings of the deities of the Hurrian pantheon. They were the people, Indo-European, probably lived in the northern part of Mesopotamia in what is now like the Kurdish regions, basically, of Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran. In Turkey, there's like all of the deities of the Hurrians in this cavern. And on one wall, it's all the male deities, and on the other wall, it's all the female deities. And Shauska, the Hurrian version of Inanna Ishtar, is on both walls because she was, even as far back as ancient Sumer, was depicted as both.
Yeah.
I am a young woman,
that's right.
but when I sit in the alehouse or the tavern, I am also an exuberant young man. And her followers would praise her. There are Sumerian hymns that praise her for changing men into women and women into men. So this is a very old thing. By the time of the Canaanite,
So Brian wasn't just
pantheon,
kind of making it up for the sake of the novel.
he was not.
Yeah.
He was
did
not.
his homework.
Astarte was represented by Venus as the evening star, but as the morning star, Athtar, the war god, who by the time of Muhammad in the 7th century A.D., Athtar, even though he wasn't the head of the pantheon for any of the tribes of Arabia, and they would all have their own pantheon, and if one tribe beat another one in battle, they would adopt the god of the other tribe because clearly that god is more powerful than our god. But the only god that was worshipped by all of the Arabian tribes was Athtar, the war god. Now, the Moabite stone, King Mesha of Moab, who was defeated in battle by Jehoshaphat and a coalition of Edomites and the Israelites came down with Jehoshaphat. Mesha is the one who slaughtered his son on the wall. And by the way, there are Egyptian inscriptions showing Canaanites in a besieged city doing this. So this is not, the biblical authors making this up to make the Canaanites and Moabites look bad. He praised his god Chemosh, who was a war god. He was equated by the later Greeks with Ares, but he called him Chemosh Athtar. In other words, two names. Yeah, so Athtar was connected to Chemosh somehow. So now you got this weird thing. It's like, okay, wait a minute. If that's Astarte and Athtar and is connected, though, to Chemosh, who was Ares, and Ares had a thing with Aphrodite, and I mean, that way lies madness. But I think this entity is so powerful. Sharon explained it once, I think a brilliant illustration. It's like finger puppets, okay? You got one hand and you got multiple finger puppets manifesting in our realm, depending on the culture that they need to impress. So that way you may have Aphrodite and Artemis and perhaps Athena and perhaps a couple of other entities in the Greek pantheon, all being the same deity, entity in the spirit realm.
Something, Derek, that you just mentioned jogged my memory too. The concept was whenever they, we've talked about this before, how images would do the calling down of the breath of the gods into the images, and so they didn't believe the images were the gods. They believed they housed or resided within those images, but nonetheless, when cities were defeated, they would often do that triumphal march, but they would do it with the deity, and that would show that the ancient Near East certainly saw that as being we've conquered the god, which is why when the Dagon statue falls, and hands are destroyed on the Dagon statue, that's Yahweh sort of saying the same thing back. But I was thinking it also is why the Philistines, they stole the ark, because the ark the ark represented the presence of Yahweh for sure. Right. But by them taking that they thought they were taking the image of the god and having control over it. And then of course God smote them with plague and stuff. But nonetheless, that's what's going on there. That notion that when they take the image of the god, they've conquered the god, and it even came into play in the lives of the Israelites as well.
I started laughing when you mentioned that because it just so happens that I'm wearing my Dagon Fish and Chip Shack T-shirt.
You got to be kidding me!
Authentic Mesopotamian cuisine since 2500 BC. Our good friend Von Glitchka developed that for us. I said, I need that on a shirt. So.
Funny.
That's hilarious.
Well, the bottom line is spiritual warfare is more than just a phrase. As our friend Carl Gallups once said, it's a little more than just praying for the willpower to resist that second bowl of vanilla ice cream. But Scripture makes it clear that there's more going on in the heavenlies outside of our vision, and we will not see into that realm clearly until well, until we're part of it, until we are brought back into that realm, like the prodigal son welcomed home. So hopefully for viewers out there or listeners that there is a little bit of clarity, a little more perhaps understanding as to why these disturbing images that we most of us haven't been taught how to reconcile with the idea of, Jesus as a kind, loving, forgiving, tolerant, inclusive guy. Jesus is my homeboy, Jesus is my boyfriend sort of depiction that the modern church often gives us. He has been waging war against these entities for literally millennia. And I love the way, Doug, you and Brian put it. It's sort of a reversal of the Roman triumph. And what's so awesome about it is that Jesus fooled them into helping him fulfill that mission.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep.
So, well, Brian Godawa, Godawa.com, Dr. Judd Burton, BurtonBeyond.net, Pastor Doug Van Dorn, DouglasVanDorn. Is it com or net, Doug?
Com.
Okay. It's you got to sit on those URLs, otherwise you get people will steal those out from underneath you.
Snap them up within about 5 minutes.
DouglasVanDorn.com. Yeah. Judd and Doug. Brian, we're still working on you. We hope you'll join us for the Iron and Myth Israel tour next March. But until then, next month, we look forward to doing this again. Check the show notes at vftb.net or wherever you are consuming this podcast for links to the websites of Pastor Doug Van Dorn, Brian Godawa, and Dr. Judd Burton, and they will be back next month for another edition of Iron and Myth. Coming up, paintings of landscapes from your native land might be dangerous. So says Cambridge University. Bless their pointy little heads. And information about a new conference, Mysteries of the Bible Verse. We'll be in Cincinnati in June. Details on that and our solidarity mission to Israel straight ahead on A View from the Bunker. It's a new month, and we have a new special at the Gilbert House online store.
We have a crazy, crazy deal on all of our DVDs. They are, regardless of the retail price, they are 75% off.
We keep hearing from the kids these days that everything is going to streaming video, that DVDs are old school.
Oh, not for us.
No, we are old school. And besides, we don't trust the internet will always be there. So take advantage of this special offer. Everything from our travel documentaries. Basically follow us as we go through the Holy Land and show you the important sites at ground zero on this supernatural war, plus video teachings, presentations, and much, much more.
You know, with 75% off savings on all the DVDs, as many as you want to get, you've got the money that you saved to go out and buy a DVD player.
That's it. Take advantage of it now online only at the Gilbert House store, gilberthouse.org/store. And thank you for your prayers and support. Talking the Walk every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert, joined in the bunker tonight by Grace, the rescue dog. She is always out here at work with me. And we thank you for joining us. You'll find us online at vftb.net. Online, you can find our websites, gilberthouse.org, derekpgilbert.com, and social media. X, formerly Twitter, View from Bunker, and Derek Gilbert. Also, Threads, but also Truth Social, Gab Me, we get her at Derek P. Gilbert, and our YouTube channel at Gilbert House, at Gilbert House. If watching there, God bless you. Thank you for that. We really do appreciate it. It is Mars Hill, a virtual Mars Hill. Please subscribe, click the bell for notifications, share the link with your friends, but then be prepared because we could at any moment find ourselves elsewhere without warning. It happened again to Skywatch TV. This is the fourth time Skywatch TV has been canceled. No explanation as to why. Got an idea. I'm not going to say here on this platform, but anyway, you'll find our free mobile app is the solution to this. It's available for iOS Android, Amazon Kindle Fire phones and tablets, brings all of our content right to you, along with an audio Bible with multiple translations, a calendar of our upcoming events, so you can know about where we're going to be before we get there, calendar of our upcoming Bible study readings, and much, much more. Also, a link to our weekly articles that we publish every Wednesday, excerpts from our books on the divine counsel and the existence of the gods and so forth. Hopefully, getting you excited about the just amazing information that is contained between the covers of your Bible. All of that and more, you'll find it at gilberthouse.org/app, gilberthouse.org/app. Well, in England, you got to wonder, I mean, what is really going on in the minds of the academics at Cambridge? The Fitzwilliam Institution, which has a number of paintings of the beautiful English countryside on display, has actually felt compelled to put trigger warnings on some of the paintings. Seriously. The Fitzwilliam Museum is putting warnings up on some of these beautiful paintings, warning that they might trigger dark nationalist feelings. Seriously. The signage states that pictures these beautiful rolling hills in England that are on display at Cambridge can stir feelings of pride towards a homeland. Shock. Horror. Apparently, it is scary to stir up feelings of nationalistic pride. Yes, don't we live in a lovely place? Perhaps we should try to preserve it and keep it this way. Oh, no, that's bad. This, because the leftists, apparently, at the Fitzwilliam Museum are concerned that pride in the place where you live might lead to, and I quote, the implication that only those with a historical tie to the land have a right to belong, end quote. Well, okay, maybe not a right to belong, but it's certainly a right to decide how it is to be governed and protected. I mean, if these people weren't in control of so many of our important cultural institutions, you could just point and laugh. But as it is, and since we're on the other side of the ocean, all we can do here is just point and say, bless your pointy little heads. We are going to be a number of places in 2024, and the calendar is getting more crowded, which is a good thing. We love the opportunity to go and speak and share the joy, the excitement we have about studying the Word of God. Our virtual conference from Skywatch TV, Countering the Darkness, on right now. It went live on February 29th, but if you sign up today, you still get 90 days access to all of the content. That is all 24 presentations, plus the 6 feature-length Skywatch Films documentaries. You can find out more and register at defenderconference.com, defenderconference.com. Now, we're just a few weeks away from the Prophetic Signs in the Heavenlies Conference in Dallas. That is Hear the Watchmen, gathering at the Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center, April 5, 6, and 7. We're staying over an extra day because the total eclipse of the sun on April 8th. Hence the title of the conference, Prophetic Signs in the Heavenlies. Join us for this along with Paul Begley, Colonel David Giamona, Dr. Carrie Mayday, Pastor Casper McLeod, David Hevner, Dave Hodges, Michael Boldea, Tov Rose, John Moore, David Paxton, Doug Thornton. A great lineup, and we hope to see you there as well. April 5, 6, 7, stay an extra day. The Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center is a great facility, and we're looking forward to a wonderful time with some very good friends. More information and registration at hearthewatchmen.com, hearthewatchmen.com. Now, Cincinnati, we're coming to the Mysteries of the Bible Verse Conference, June 7th and 8th. This is at the Marriott Cincinnati Airport. That's in Hebron, Ohio, so just south of the river. This is going to be a great lineup, and the subject matter is just right up our alley. Other speakers include Mike Hoggard. Have not seen Mike in a long time, even though he's here in Missouri. Mike Hoggard will be there. Rudy Landa, documentary filmmaker, who did the documentary with Doug Van Dorn called Angels and Giants. So he will be there. Micah Van Huss, who is really an interesting thinker. I want to talk to him about his books, because this is being produced by Southwest Radio Ministries. Micah is connected with that ministry, but also see Mac Dominic, Greg Patton, and yours truly. And I'll be giving the keynote address on Saturday on the second coming of Saturn. So we hope you join us in Cincinnati. This is June 7 and 8, and we will see you at the Cincinnati Airport Marriott. Other events coming up this year, we will be at His Call Ministries. That's in Sparta, Missouri, just south of Springfield, June 21st and 23rd. 21st, 22nd, 23rd. That's just Sharon and me teaching for the whole weekend. The Go Therefore Conference. The Harvest Revival Center, Brookville, just outside Dayton, Ohio, July 26th and 27th. Some good friends there, Dr. Michael Lake, L.A. Marzulli, Pastor Paul Begley, Dr. Greg Reed, Pastor Carl Gallups, Dr. Judd Burton joining us for this one, and, of course, Dr. Mike Spalding putting this one together. Pastor Neil Peterson offering up his church, a great facility for the conference. Again, that's the end of July at the Harvest Revival Center. You can find out more online at gothereforeconference.com, gothereforeconference.com, and North Dakota coming back for the Pitchfork and Hoe gathering this time in early September instead of late October. We'll be there September 6th and 7th. The Eagles Club, Valley City, North Dakota. Looking forward to coming back and speaking a couple of times there. You can find out more. Follow the link at our website, gilberthouse.org. You'll find that the calendar is in the right-hand sidebar, or go to our app. Download the app, go to the calendar tab, and follow us there. Our Solidarity Mission to Israel. This is coming up in about 6 weeks. We are looking to put together a small group of maybe 24 people willing to go with us to stand arm in arm with the people of Israel. May 6th through 13th, we would visit Tel Aviv, Hostage Square. We would go to Gush Etzion, which was the site of a very key battle in the 1948 War for Independence. It essentially is Israel's Alamo. We'll go to a couple sites in the south, in the Negev, that were attacked on October 7th and have a barbecue with IDF soldiers down there. And of course, we'll visit important sites in Israel, like the Temple Mount, the Mount of Olives, the Western Wall, and more. You can find information at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel, gilberthouse.org/travel. There's a link there that'll take you to the Lipkin Tours website. But don't delay. We really need to make a decision by the end of March as to whether we've got enough of a group to go. And we pray that we can put this together and stand with Israel and also help our friends out at Lipkin Tours, because obviously when something like this happens, difficult to... the whole economy in Israel has taken a real hit. And so we hope we can be of some help to them at this time. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen. And if you would, take a moment, leave a review at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, wherever fine podcasts are sold. Our announcer is the inimitable D.C. Good. And A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. And good night, Oliver, wherever you are. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.